Hello, I'm Dr. Arran Johnston from the Battle of Prestonpans 1745 Heritage Trust and the curator of this exhibition here at the John Gray Centre, Hey Johnnie Cope, the Battle of Prestonpans in Art, Song and Story. And the purpose of this exhibition is to really tell the tale not of the Battle of Prestonpans per se, but how the story of the battle has been told through artworks, songs and poetry over the 276 years since the battle took place. Which is of course why it's called Hey Johnnie Cope, the line from the most famous of all the songs about the Battle of Prestonpans, written by Adam Skirving just days after the battle itself. And the exhibition opens with this collection of images. Here, the famous caricature of Johnnie Cope running to the gates of Berwick with the news of his own defeat, and then two images from the middle of the 19th century. These are hand-coloured images that have been taken from editions of Walter Scott's great novel Waverley. And together these really capture some of the key themes that run through the exhibition. Firstly, the debate over Johnnie Cope's role in the battle, criticisms, caricatures, lampooning and mockery. Then there's the thorn tree, the great Prestonpans landmark, where Colonel Gardiner's body was found at the end of the battle. And here a 19th century view across that battlefield landscape, representative of the uptick in interest in the Jacobites that came with Waverley, Scott, and then into the 19th century Romanticism. And those are themes that were picked up through a lot of the objects that carry the story through, from the 18th century right the way through the 19th and on into the 21st. Obviously the Battle of Prestonpans was part of a bigger story, and the way that we've tried to contextualise that is by using these three embroidered panels from the Scottish diaspora tapestry. Now these three panels, which is from a tapestry that tells the story of Scottish migration and the influence of Scots around the world across the centuries, show several phases in the Jacobite story. Here is Prince Charlie's father, James Francis Stuart, the would-be King James VIII of Scotland and III of England, and behind him the Chateau de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where the Stuarts had their first court in exile. That court then moved to Rome, and this family scene here shows James with his wife and his two sons, Charles and Henry. And in 1744, it was Charles who moved into France to try and take up the opportunity to restore the fortunes of the family. And this third panel celebrates the connections between Brittany and Charles Edward's departure on his great adventure of 1745. So, new embroideries telling a very old story. And the role of Prince Charlie, of course, in the Battle of Prestonpans is one of the most talked about aspects of it. Prince Charlie, a hugely controversial character even today, and portrayed very differently across the centuries. This is a 20th century portrait that the Trust commissioned in 2010 by the Edinburgh artist Kate Hunter, and it shows Prince Charlie as he might have appeared in his mid-20s at the time of the Battle of Prestonpans. You can see that it's been inspired by the famous de la Tour portrait, which was proven, in fact, to be Charles Edward's brother. But nevertheless, it shows the prince as proud, confident, bedecked in tartan with that jewelled star of the Garter and his hand gripping the hilt of the basket hilt that was carrying his forces to victory, so far so good, in September 1745. Quite a contrast to that is this 19th century small painting here, which is a copy of an earlier picture, and this shows Prince Charlie much more as he was commonly seen in the 19th century, softer featured, pursed lips, almost feminine, as the romanticism of the story blooms when it's safe again to start telling stories of the Jacobites, and when the contrast between the soft foreign-born prince and the burly Highlanders that he was leading gave so much inspiration to the storytellers of the Victorian age. Prince Charlie is one of the most familiar faces in Scotland's history, but his opponent at Prestonpans, Johnnie Cope, is rather less so. There's a matching portrait with the Prince Charlie we've just seen by Kate Hunter of Johnnie Cope here, which is inspired by the only two known images we have of Cope. One down in Norfolk, a large oil painting of him as a younger man, probably him as a younger man, and a caricature that was drawn by his political enemies. And Kate used both of those illustrations as a means of trying to get a thought for the face of General Cope there. But as goes General Cope's character and his performance of the battle, of course it was controversial. The song Hey Johnnie Cope, which is printed down here in some of these 19th century songbooks, and it was a hugely popular song, was so popular that General Cope himself was furious, and it was one of the forces behind insisting there was a court of inquiry into his conduct. And there's a report here from the 1740s of the findings of that inquiry and all the testimony, and it's open here at a page that describes some of the events here in Haddington when General Cope was moving his army through. There's also a letter written by General Cope here, a few years after the battle, to his friend Thomas Fawkes, who was his brigadier at Prestonpans. The idea here is just to give a sense that this was a real man. We might all know the lyrics, or at least the tune, to Hey Johnnie Cope, but behind the story was a professional soldier whose career had been going up and up and up until this shocking event in September 1745. Not until Robert Cadell, at the end of the 19th century, writes a new history of the battle, trying to redeem Cope's reputation, does anybody start to think seriously about re-evaluating Cope's performance. And there's a copy of Cadell's book in here as well. It wasn't in fact Cope, though, who was the most famous British officer at the Battle of Prestonpans, certainly not after it, because the stories that were told immediately after the battle really focus on James Gardner. He was the highest ranking British casualty at the battle, and his friend Philip Doddridge, a minister in England, wrote firstly a sermon about him that he printed after he preached at the pulpit, and then a full-blown biography of Gardner. And that not only sold huge amounts of copies in its own right, but it also inspired artists and poets to pick up on the story. Here, a late 18th century engraving of Gardner leaving his wife and daughter at the gates of Stirling Castle in the weeks before the battle, and a tinted lithograph of a very famous William Allen painting of the death of Colonel Gardner, came in the middle of the 19th century. This case here, which really tells the story of Gardner, and there he is at the back, as depicted in a posthumous portrait done for an edition of Walter Scott's Waverley. Here we see the London Post newspaper that lists Gardner's death amongst those other casualties that were being reported. Early copy of the biography and a 1745 copy of the sermon that Doddridge preached. But then, more surprisingly, a few items down there showing how the images that are taken from those works became so popular. The 19th century painting of Gardner's death somehow appearing in the 1970s on a Skids album. At the back of the case here, we've got two pieces of hawthorn, and those are fragments of the tree beneath which Gardner was found, mortally wounded on the morning of the Battle of Prestonpans. The two pieces, one from the collection of the Battle of Prestonpans Trust, one from East Lothian Council's collection here, brought together perhaps for the first time since the tree was broken down, having died and broken into these sections in the late 1920s. So Gardner's story was really important, not only because of his own role, his own character, but also because of the impact that the stories of his death and his life had on the way that the story of the battle was told in the subsequent decades. This part of the gallery brings us even further towards our own times, however, and we come to another illustration from a Walter Scott edition, this time rather later than some of the others that were in the exhibition. This one choosing the scene of Laird Balmawhapple as he fled, as he was carried away rather from the battlefield at Prestonpans by his runaway horse, pursuing the fugitive dragoons. It's a comedy of amusing little sequences in this particular illustration, and it picks up quite a different set of themes to the more serious inspirations that occur elsewhere. Also produced for a book is this painting by Peter Dennis, which was done in around 2017, and this shows Gardner's subordinate officer, Lieutenant Colonel Whitney, and the 13th Dragoons attempting to charge into the Stuarts of Appin at Preston Pans, but Whitney himself wounded in the arm and subsequently taken prisoner by the Jacobites. So a critical moment in the battle depicted in a rather vivid and dramatic picture, which contrasts to this image by Janet McCrory, done just a few years later, and this mixed media image very much designed to show the drama and the sort of movement of the pursuit of the battle. You can tell it's Preston Pans because you've got the Forth and the hills of Fife there behind as the Jacobite pursues the redcoat soldier, and the Jacobite here is wearing the tartan of the Battle of Preston Pans Heritage Trust. So very much part of the Trust's contribution to the cultural legacy of the battle are commissions just like this. In the 20th century, though, it wasn't just books and novels like Waverley and songs like Hey Johnnie Coke that people were looking to get their stories of what had happened in 1745. Of course, on the big screen, the story was being told as well, right since the 1920s, when the first Bonnie Prince Charlie film was made with Ivor Novello. And then, more famously, in the 1940s, when it was David Niven's turn to portray the Prince. And that film shows the Battle of Preston Pans as its key battle sequence. Lots of drama, lots of action, smoke and mist and chaos, and poor old Johnnie Cope, just as he's portrayed in so many other forms of art, showed helpless to stem the rout and riding off to save himself at the end of the surprise attack. And here in the case behind me, some memorabilia from that film, including a script down here, which is open to give you some idea of the drama that's happening during that battle. And of course, that wasn't the last time that the Battle of Preston Pans appeared on screen, and most recently it's appeared as part of the TV series Outlander, which comes from the Diana Gabaldon novels, the Outlander novels, and here in the case there's a copy of The Dragonfly in Amber, which tells the story of Battle of Preston Pans in the context of that remarkably popular novelisation and subsequent dramatisation. So the Battle of Preston Pans has been shown in song, in poetry, in music, in artworks, engravings and paintings, ever since the battle took place, right the way through all forms of popular media, through onto our TV screens as well. But one of the things that we mustn't forget is that ultimately the battle is a story of human courage and human tragedy. And perhaps it's therefore fitting that we end the exhibition with this image by the late Andy Hillhouse, famous military painter, and this was one of his, in fact, last great paintings, completed in 2016. And it's entitled Victory at Preston Pans. But there's not a lot that's victorious about it. The Highlanders in the foreground, huddled into the breaches in the walls of Preston House Gardens, look weary, tired, some of them wounded, and they're looking across the landscape towards North Berwick there, and before them is the detritus of battle, the casualties, the wounded and the dead, and those dead being buried by the civilians of the communities around the battlefield, and behind them the thorn tree where Colonel Gardner had been found. So ultimately we remember at the end of the exhibition the sacrifice of those whose stories may not be the ones that come out in the artworks most commonly, may not be the ones that we sing about, but are certainly the ones who made the story of the Battle of Preston Pans.